Welcome to True Crime Open and Closed, where we examine the cases that have shaped our understanding of justice, investigation, and the human condition. I'm your host, and today we delve into a case that reminds us why the pursuit of truth matters, why every victim deserves justice, and why the dedicated work of investigators and prosecutors serves as the foundation of our legal system. Before we begin, please be aware that today's episode contains descriptions of violence and criminal acts that some listeners may find disturbing. We approach these stories with the utmost respect for the victims and their families, recognizing that behind every case file is a human tragedy that forever changed the lives of those involved. Our story today takes us to Los Angeles in 1947, where what began as an ordinary January morning would become anything but ordinary. This is the story of Elizabeth Short, a young woman whose brutal murder would become one of America's most infamous unsolved cases, a case that would test the limits of investigative work and challenge our understanding of how media attention can both help and hinder the pursuit of justice. Chapter 1. The Discovery. It was 10 minutes past 10 in the morning on January the 15th, 1947, when Betty Bersinger decided to take her 3-year-old daughter Anne for a walk through the quiet residential neighborhood of Leimert Park in Los Angeles. The morning air was crisp and clear, typical of Southern California winter weather, with the kind of golden sunlight that had drawn millions of Americans westward in search of dreams and new beginnings. Betty had chosen their route carefully, planning to walk south on Norton Avenue toward Coliseum Street, a pleasant tree-lined stretch where the sidewalks were wide enough for Anne's small legs to navigate safely. The neighborhood was respectable, middle class, filled with modest single-family homes where working families had settled to build their version of the American dream. Children played in well-tended yards, and neighbors greeted each other with the casual familiarity of people who had chosen this particular corner of the sprawling city as their home. As they walked hand in hand down the 1400 block of South Norton Avenue, Betty noticed something unusual lying in a vacant lot between the sidewalk and the street. At first glance, it appeared to be a discarded department store mannequin, the kind of display figure that stores sometimes threw away when updating their window presentations. The stark white appearance, and the way it lay in two distinct sections, certainly suggested artificial limbs arranged carelessly by someone cleaning out a shop. But as Betty drew closer, still holding Anne's small hand, a terrible realization began to dawn. The morning light revealed details that no mannequin would possess: the unmistakable curve of human anatomy, the subtle variations in skin tone that only living tissue could create, even in death. What Betty Bersinger had discovered in that vacant lot was not a discarded store display, but the brutally mutilated remains of a young woman who had been posed with deliberate, horrifying precision. The body had been severed completely at the waist, with the two halves placed approximately 1 foot apart on the grass, arms positioned above the head in what investigators would later describe as a grotesque parody of surrender. The victim's face bore evidence of savage mutilation, with cuts extending from the corners of the mouth to the ears in what would become known as a Glasgow smile. The body had been completely drained of blood and scrubbed clean, giving it the unnaturally pale, almost porcelain-like appearance that had initially led Betty to mistake it for a mannequin. Fighting back waves of nausea and horror, Betty quickly scooped up her daughter and ran to the nearest house, where she pounded frantically on the door, until a neighbor answered. Through tears and trembling words, she managed to convey what she had discovered, and within minutes, the first police call had been placed to the Los Angeles Police Department. At exactly 23 minutes past 10 on that January morning, the Black Dahlia case officially began. Detective Sergeant Finis Brown was among the first officers to arrive at the scene, pulling up to the vacant lot in his unmarked police vehicle, just as curious neighbors began to gather at a respectful distance. Brown, a veteran of the LAPD with more than 15 years of experience investigating violent crimes, would later describe the scene as one of the most disturbing he had encountered in his entire career. The methodical nature of the mutilation, the careful positioning of the body parts, and the clinical cleanliness of the remains all suggested a perpetrator with either medical knowledge or an extremely disturbed psychological profile. As Brown began the preliminary examination of the scene, he was joined by Detective Harry Hansen, another experienced investigator who would become one of the primary detectives assigned to the case. Hansen immediately recognized that they were dealing with something far beyond the typical street violence that characterized much of Los Angeles crime in 1947. The precision of the bisection, which appeared to have been performed with surgical skill, suggested someone with anatomical knowledge, while the complete drainage and cleaning of the body indicated both time and a private location where such extensive preparation could be conducted without interruption. The coroner's team arrived at approximately 11:15, led by Deputy Coroner Dr. Frederick Newbar, who would conduct the official examination of the remains. Even before the body was moved to the morgue, Dr. Newbar could determine that the victim was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, with dark hair and what had likely been an attractive appearance before the brutal mutilation. The cause of death appeared to be shock and hemorrhage due to the facial lacerations, though a complete autopsy would be necessary to determine the exact sequence of events that had led to this horrific end. As news of the discovery spread through the police radio network, the vacant lot on Norton Avenue became the center of intense investigative activity. Crime scene photographers documented every detail of the body's position, while detectives began the painstaking process of searching the surrounding area for any evidence that might lead to the killer's identity. The fact that the body had been carefully posed and placed in such a public location suggested that the perpetrator wanted the remains to be discovered, adding a disturbing element of theatrical display to an already horrific crime. Chapter 2. Elizabeth Short, a life cut short. The young woman whose brutalized remains lay in that vacant lot had been born Elizabeth Short in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, on July the 29th, 1924. She was the third of 5 daughters born to Cleo and Phoebe Short, a working-class family struggling through the economic uncertainties of the 1920s and 30s. Elizabeth's childhood was marked by instability and abandonment when her father, Cleo Short, disappeared when she was just 6 years old, leaving behind only a car near a bridge, leading the family to believe he had committed suicide. Growing up without a father in a household of women, Elizabeth developed early the kind of fierce independence and desperate hunger for male attention that would characterize her adult relationships. Her mother, Phoebe, worked multiple jobs to support her 5 daughters, leaving little time for the kind of supervision and guidance that might have helped Elizabeth navigate the complex social pressures of adolescence. As she entered her teenage years, Elizabeth began to demonstrate the restless energy and dissatisfaction with small-town life that would eventually draw her across the country to California. At 19 years of age, Elizabeth made her first journey to California, drawn by the same Hollywood dreams that beckoned thousands of young women during the 1940s. She possessed the kind of striking dark beauty that suggested screen potential, tall and slender at 5 feet 6 inches, with pale skin, dark hair, and the kind of dramatic features that photographed well. Like countless other young women of her generation, Elizabeth believed that her natural beauty and determination would be enough to break into the competitive world of film and entertainment. However, the reality of Hollywood proved far more challenging than Elizabeth's dreams had anticipated. Work was scarce, competition was fierce, and the kind of connections necessary for success in the entertainment industry remained frustratingly out of reach. Elizabeth found herself taking a series of temporary jobs, waitressing, working in clothing stores, and occasionally modeling for photographers who promised to help her build a portfolio that might lead to acting opportunities. During this period, Elizabeth developed the habits and associations that would eventually lead investigators to hundreds of potential suspects and witnesses. She frequently moved between different apartments and rooming houses, often staying with casual acquaintances when money ran short. Her social circle included other aspiring actresses, photographers, servicemen on leave, and the kind of men who frequented the bars and night spots where young women gathered hoping to meet someone who might advance their careers. Elizabeth's romantic relationships were complex and often troubled, characterized by her apparent preference for men in uniform and her tendency to become involved with individuals who were either unavailable or emotionally unstable. Friends would later describe her as desperate for love and acceptance, willing to overlook significant character flaws in the men she dated if they offered her the attention and validation she craved. This pattern of relationships would provide investigators with a vast network of potential suspects, each with varying degrees of connection to Elizabeth's final days. In the months leading up to her death, Elizabeth's life had become increasingly unstable. She had returned briefly to Massachusetts in 1946, but found small-town life suffocating after her experiences in California. By late 1946, she was back in Los Angeles, staying with various friends and acquaintances while continuing to pursue her elusive dreams of stardom. Financial pressures were mounting, and those who knew her during this period described a young woman who was becoming increasingly desperate and willing to take risks that might have exposed her to dangerous individuals. Elizabeth's appearance during her final months was distinctive enough that many witnesses would later be able to identify her from photographs. She typically dressed entirely in black, earning her the nickname that would later become internationally famous. Her preference for black clothing, combined with her dark hair and pale complexion, created a dramatic, almost gothic appearance that made her memorable to those who encountered her, even briefly. The last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth alive occurred on January the 9th, 1947, when she was seen at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. Witnesses reported that she appeared to be waiting for someone in the hotel lobby, checking her watch frequently and seeming anxious or nervous. After that sighting, Elizabeth Short disappeared completely, entering what investigators would later determine was a 6-day period during which she was held captive, tortured, and ultimately murdered in circumstances that suggested both premeditation and extreme psychological disturbance. Those who knew Elizabeth described a young woman who, despite her struggles and disappointments, remained fundamentally optimistic about her future. She continued to believe that her break would come, that the right opportunity would present itself, and that her beauty and determination would eventually overcome the obstacles that had frustrated her dreams. The tragedy of her death was not only the brutal manner in which her life ended, but also the loss of that hope and potential that had brought her across the country in pursuit of a better life. Chapter 3. The Crime Scene Investigation. Dr. Frederick Newbar began his preliminary examination of the remains at the crime scene with the methodical precision that had made him one of Los Angeles County's most respected forensic pathologists. Even before the body was transported to the morgue for complete autopsy, several disturbing facts were immediately apparent to the experienced coroner. The bisection of the body had been performed with surgical precision, indicating either medical knowledge or extensive anatomical study on the part of the perpetrator. The cuts were clean and deliberate, made with an extremely sharp instrument, possibly a surgical scalpel or similar medical tool. The complete drainage of blood from the remains presented investigators with their first major clue about the location where the actual murder had taken place. The vacant lot on Norton Avenue showed no evidence of blood spatter or pooling, despite the extensive mutilation that had been inflicted on the victim. This absence of blood evidence led investigators to conclude that Elizabeth Short had been killed elsewhere, then transported to the Norton Avenue location after the body had been thoroughly cleaned and prepared for display. Detective Hansen immediately recognized the significance of this finding. The killer had not only murdered Elizabeth Short, but had also invested considerable time and effort in preparing her remains for public discovery. This suggested a perpetrator with access to a private location where extensive post-mortem procedures could be conducted without interruption, possibly a home with a basement, a medical facility, or some other space where the killer could work undisturbed for several hours or even days. The positioning of the body parts also provided insight into the killer's psychological state and possible motivations. The two halves of the torso had been placed precisely 1 foot apart, with the arms positioned above the head in what appeared to be a deliberate pose. The legs were spread in a sexually suggestive manner, while the face bore evidence of mutilation that seemed designed to destroy the victim's beauty, the very attribute that had brought Elizabeth to Los Angeles in pursuit of her Hollywood dreams. Crime scene photographers, working under the direction of the LAPD's technical division, documented every aspect of the scene with the kind of thoroughness that would later prove invaluable as the investigation expanded to include hundreds of potential suspects. The photographs revealed not only the horrific nature of the crime, but also the killer's apparent desire for the remains to be discovered and his twisted need for public attention. Detective Sergeant Brown began the systematic search of the surrounding area, looking for any evidence that might have been left behind by the perpetrator or that might provide clues to Elizabeth's final movements. The vacant lot itself yielded little physical evidence, no footprints, no discarded items, no tire tracks that might indicate how the body had been transported to the location. This absence of evidence was itself significant. suggesting a killer who had planned carefully and taken steps to avoid leaving traces that might lead to identification. The neighborhood canvass began immediately, with detectives interviewing residents of the surrounding blocks to determine whether anyone had seen or heard anything unusual during the previous evening. The fact that the body had been discovered in mid-morning suggested that it had been placed during the nighttime hours, when darkness would have provided cover for the killer's activities. However, the residential nature of the neighborhood meant that the risk of discovery during the deposit of the remains had been considerable, indicating either careful surveillance of the area or a perpetrator confident enough in his methods to accept such risks. Dr. Newbar's preliminary examination revealed evidence of extensive ante-mortem torture, with rope marks on the wrists and ankles indicating that Elizabeth had been bound for an extended period before her death. The facial mutilations, particularly the cuts extending from the corners of the mouth, had been inflicted while the victim was still alive, suggesting a killer who derived satisfaction from causing prolonged suffering. These findings would later be confirmed by the complete autopsy, which would reveal the full extent of the torture inflicted upon Elizabeth during her final days. The coroner's team carefully removed the remains from the crime scene at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, transporting them to the Los Angeles County morgue for complete forensic examination. As the body was loaded into the coroner's van, a crowd of curious onlookers had gathered despite police efforts to maintain the scene's security. Among the crowd were newspaper reporters who had monitored police radio frequencies and recognized the significance of the crime scene activity on Norton Avenue. Detective Hansen made the decision to release minimal information to the press at this early stage of the investigation, understanding that media attention could both help and hinder the investigative process. While public awareness might generate tips and witness accounts that could prove valuable, sensationalized coverage could also contaminate potential evidence and encourage false confessions from attention-seeking individuals. This delicate balance between public information and investigative security would become a constant challenge throughout the Black Dahlia case. As the crime scene was secured and the initial investigation concluded, Detective Brown and Detective Hansen began the process of organizing what they already recognized would be one of the most complex and challenging cases in LAPD history. The methodical nature of the crime, the apparent medical knowledge of the perpetrator, and the theatrical display of the remains all suggested a killer with both sophisticated criminal planning abilities and severe psychological disturbance, a combination that would make identification and apprehension extremely difficult. Chapter 4. The investigation begins. The formal investigation into the murder of Elizabeth Short began within hours of the discovery of her remains, as Captain Jack Donahoe of the LAPD's Detective Division assembled what would become one of the largest investigative teams in the department's history. Recognizing the unusual nature of the crime and anticipating significant public interest, Captain Donahoe assigned Detective Sergeant Harry Hansen as the primary investigator, supported by Detective Sergeant Finis Brown and a team of additional detectives who would follow up on what everyone expected would be hundreds of leads and potential suspects. The first priority was establishing the victim's identity, a task that proved surprisingly challenging given the mutilation inflicted on Elizabeth's face. Standard fingerprint comparison would normally have provided quick identification, but Elizabeth Short had never been arrested or employed in a position requiring fingerprint records. However, the FBI's cooperation proved invaluable when agents were able to match Elizabeth's prints to a set taken during a brief arrest for underage drinking in Santa Barbara several years earlier. Once the victim's identity was confirmed, investigators began the painstaking process of reconstructing Elizabeth's final weeks and identifying everyone who had contact with her during the period leading up to her disappearance. This process revealed the complex web of relationships and casual acquaintances that characterized Elizabeth's transient lifestyle in Los Angeles. She had stayed with numerous friends and acquaintances, dated various men, and frequented multiple night spots and restaurants throughout the city. Detective Hansen established a comprehensive filing system to track the hundreds of tips, witness statements, and suspect interviews that began pouring in almost immediately after news of the murder became public. The LAPD's switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from individuals claiming to have information about Elizabeth's death, ranging from legitimate witness accounts to obvious hoaxes and attention-seeking false confessions. Each call required investigation and follow-up, creating an enormous workload for the detective team. The autopsy conducted by Dr. Noir provided crucial information about the circumstances of Elizabeth's death and the timeline of events leading to the discovery of her remains. The examination confirmed that Elizabeth had been killed approximately 3 to 4 days before her body was discovered, placing the time of death sometime between January the 10th and 12th. The cause of death was determined to be shock and hemorrhage resulting from the facial lacerations, though extensive evidence of torture suggested that the killer had prolonged Elizabeth's suffering over a period of several days. Perhaps most significantly, the autopsy revealed that Elizabeth had been sexually assaulted, though the extent of the sexual violence had been obscured by the post-mortem mutilation. This finding suggested a perpetrator motivated by sexual sadism and a desire to completely dominate and dehumanize his victim. The combination of sexual violence, prolonged torture, and elaborate post-mortem display indicated a killer with both extreme psychological disturbance and sufficient intelligence to plan and execute a complex crime. The investigation team established a timeline of Elizabeth's known movements during her final weeks, beginning with her return to Los Angeles in late December of 1946. Witnesses placed her at various locations throughout the city, including restaurants, bars, and hotels where she had met with different male companions. Each of these encounters represented a potential lead, and detectives began the systematic process of identifying and interviewing every man known to have had contact with Elizabeth during this crucial period. The media attention surrounding the case intensified rapidly, with newspaper reporters competing to provide the most sensational coverage of what was already being called the crime of the century. The Los Angeles Examiner, in particular, provided extensive daily coverage that included crime scene photographs, details of the investigation, and speculation about potential suspects. While this coverage helped generate public interest and tips from potential witnesses, it also created significant challenges for investigators attempting to maintain the integrity of their investigation. Detective Brown focused his efforts on the technical aspects of the case, working closely with the LAPD's crime laboratory to analyze the limited physical evidence recovered from the crime scene and the victim's remains. The absence of blood evidence at the Norton Avenue location confirmed that Elizabeth had been killed elsewhere, leading investigators to begin searching for the primary crime scene where the actual murder and mutilation had taken place. This search would ultimately prove futile, as the killer had apparently chosen a location that could be thoroughly cleaned and sanitized after the completion of his crimes. The rope marks found on Elizabeth's wrists and ankles were analyzed to determine the type of binding material used, though this analysis yielded limited investigative value. The rope appeared to be common cotton clothesline of the type available at any hardware store, providing no specific clues to the killer's identity or location. Similarly, analysis of the tool marks left by the bisection of the body confirmed the use of an extremely sharp knife or surgical instrument, but could not narrow the field of potential weapons significantly. As the investigation entered its second week, the detective team had compiled a list of more than 50 potential suspects, ranging from men who had dated Elizabeth in the months before her death to individuals with previous convictions for sexual violence who lived in the Los Angeles area. Each suspect required thorough investigation, including alibi verification, background checks, and psychological evaluation where possible. This process would ultimately consume thousands of investigative hours and extend the case for months without producing a viable arrest. Chapter 5. Following the Trail. The breakthrough in identifying Elizabeth Short's movements during her final week came from an unexpected source. A young woman named Dorothy French, who had read about the murder in the newspapers and recognized Elizabeth's photograph. Dorothy contacted the police on January the 18th to report that Elizabeth had stayed at her family's home in Pacific Beach, near San Diego, during the first week of January, just days before her disappearance and death. According to Dorothy's account, Elizabeth had arrived at the French family home on January the 1st, introduced by Dorothy's boyfriend, who had met Elizabeth at a local nightclub. Elizabeth told the French family that she was waiting for money from her sister in Massachusetts and needed a temporary place to stay while making arrangements to return home. The French, struck by Elizabeth's apparent desperation and moved by her story of financial difficulties, offered her a room in their house and treated her as a temporary member of their family. During the week Elizabeth spent with the French family, Dorothy observed behavior that would later prove significant to investigators. Elizabeth received several telephone calls from men, including one particularly troubling conversation that left her visibly upset and frightened. After completing this call, Elizabeth asked Dorothy if she could stay longer, claiming that she no longer wanted to return to Los Angeles but was afraid of someone who was expecting her there. Detective Hansen traveled to San Diego to interview the French family and examine Elizabeth's belongings, which she had left behind when she suddenly departed their home on January the 8th. Among her possessions, investigators found letters from several men, including correspondence that suggested Elizabeth had been involved in relationships with married men who had made promises about leaving their wives. These letters provided investigators with additional suspects and confirmed the pattern of troubled relationships that had characterized Elizabeth's final months. The French family's account established that Elizabeth had left their home voluntarily on January the 8th, telling them that she had decided to return to Los Angeles after receiving a phone call that seemed to resolve whatever situation had been troubling her. Dorothy French reported that Elizabeth's demeanor had changed completely after this final phone call. She seemed excited and optimistic, as if she believed her problems were about to be solved. This would be the last time anyone would see Elizabeth Short alive and in good spirits. From the French family home, investigators were able to trace Elizabeth's movements to the Greyhound bus station in San Diego, where she had purchased a ticket to Los Angeles on the afternoon of January the 8th. Bus records confirmed that she had made the journey that evening, arriving at the downtown Los Angeles terminal sometime after 9 o'clock. From that point, her movements became much more difficult to track, though several witnesses later reported seeing her in the vicinity of the Biltmore Hotel during the following day. The investigation into Elizabeth's activities during her stay with the French family revealed additional troubling details about her state of mind and her relationships with various men. Dorothy French recalled that Elizabeth had spoken frequently about her desire to find a wealthy man who could provide her with financial security and help her achieve her Hollywood ambitions. This desire had apparently led her to become involved with several men simultaneously, creating a complex web of relationships that investigators would spend months attempting to untangle. Detective Brown focused his investigation on the telephone calls Elizabeth had received while staying with the French family, working with telephone company records to identify the sources of these calls. Several calls had originated from Los Angeles area phone numbers registered to men who would later become primary suspects in the case. The pattern of these calls suggested that Elizabeth had been maintaining relationships with multiple men, possibly leading each to believe that he was her exclusive romantic partner. The discovery of Elizabeth's belongings at the French house provided investigators with additional evidence about her lifestyle and relationships. Her personal effects included photographs of herself with various men, correspondence from admirers and potential romantic partners, and a small address book containing names and phone numbers of contacts throughout California. Each entry in this address book represented a potential lead, and detectives began the systematic process of identifying and interviewing every person listed. Among the most significant items recovered from Elizabeth's belongings was a small diary in which she had recorded her thoughts and feelings during the weeks leading up to her death. The diary entries revealed a young woman struggling with depression, financial difficulties, and increasingly desperate attempts to find someone who could provide her with the love and security she craved. The final entries, made during her stay with the French family, expressed both hope about her future and fear about returning to Los Angeles to face whatever situation she had been trying to escape. The psychological profile that emerged from Elizabeth's diary entries and the observations of the French family painted a picture of a deeply troubled young woman whose vulnerability had likely made her an attractive target for a predatory killer. Her desperate need for male attention, combined with her willingness to trust men she barely knew, had created a lifestyle that exposed her to significant danger. This vulnerability, investigators realized, would have been immediately apparent to anyone who spent time with Elizabeth, making her an ideal victim for someone seeking to exploit and ultimately destroy a helpless young woman. Detective Hansen began developing a timeline of events that would account for Elizabeth's movements from her departure from the French family home on January the 8th until the discovery of her remains on January the 15th. This 7-day period represented the crucial window during which Elizabeth had encountered her killer, been taken to whatever location served as the primary crime scene, and ultimately murdered after days of torture and sexual assault. Chapter 6. The Media Circus and False Leads. The intense media attention surrounding the Black Dahlia case created both opportunities and obstacles for the investigating detectives. The Los Angeles Examiner, under the aggressive leadership of city editor James Richardson, provided daily front-page coverage that included crime scene photographs, speculative articles about potential suspects, and detailed descriptions of the mutilation inflicted upon Elizabeth Short. This sensationalized coverage captured public imagination and generated hundreds of tips from readers. But it also attracted attention-seeking individuals who would confess to the crime or provide false information that consumed valuable investigative resources. Within the first month of the investigation, the LAPD had received more than 300 phone calls from individuals claiming to have information about Elizabeth's murder. Detective Sergeant Hansen established a systematic process for evaluating these tips, assigning junior detectives to conduct preliminary interviews and identify which leads merited serious follow-up investigation. This process revealed the extraordinary public fascination with the case, but also the tendency of disturbed individuals to insert themselves into high-profile criminal investigations. The newspaper coverage included publication of details about the crime that investigators had hoped to keep confidential for investigative purposes. The revelation that Elizabeth's body had been drained of blood and thoroughly cleaned before being placed at the Norton Avenue location provided the killer with confirmation that his methods had been discovered and analyzed. More problematically, the publication of these details enabled false confessors to provide seemingly authentic accounts of the crime that required extensive investigation to disprove. Detective Brown became increasingly frustrated with the media's interference in the investigation, particularly when reporters began conducting their own parallel investigations and publishing information that compromised ongoing police work. In one notable incident, an Examiner reporter contacted potential witnesses before police investigators could interview them, potentially contaminating their testimony and alerting suspects to the direction of the official investigation. This competition between law enforcement and the press would characterize the entire Black Dahlia case and establish patterns that would influence crime reporting for decades to come. The most significant false confession came from Robert "Red" Manley, a 25-year-old married salesman who had dated Elizabeth during her final weeks and had actually driven her from San Diego to Los Angeles on January the 8th. Manley voluntarily contacted police after reading about Elizabeth's murder and recognizing her photograph in the newspapers. His admission that he had been the last person known to have seen Elizabeth alive immediately made him the primary suspect in the case. Under intensive interrogation, Manley admitted to having had a sexual relationship with Elizabeth, despite being married with a young child. He described Elizabeth as emotionally unstable and increasingly desperate during their final encounters, confirming the psychological profile that investigators had developed based on other witness accounts. However, Manley's story contained inconsistencies that led investigators to subject him to a polygraph examination and extensive background investigation. The polygraph examination of Robert Manley produced inconclusive results, with the examiner noting signs of deception but being unable to determine whether Manley was lying about his involvement in Elizabeth's murder or simply about details of their relationship that he wished to conceal from his wife. Detective Hansen ordered around-the-clock surveillance of Manley, while continuing to investigate his activities during the crucial period between January the 8th and 15th. Manley's account of his final encounter with Elizabeth provided investigators with important information about her state of mind and her plans during her last day alive. According to Manley, he had dropped Elizabeth off at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles on the evening of January the 8th, where she claimed to be meeting her sister who was visiting from Massachusetts. Hotel records showed no reservation under Elizabeth's name or her sister's name, and Elizabeth's family confirmed that no sister had traveled to California during this period, indicating that Elizabeth had lied to Manley about her reasons for returning to Los Angeles. The investigation of Manley's background revealed no history of violence or sexual assault, though it did uncover a pattern of extramarital relationships that had created significant stress in his marriage. Psychological evaluation suggested that while Manley was capable of deception regarding his personal relationships, he did not display the kind of extreme pathological behavior that would be consistent with the brutal murder and mutilation of Elizabeth Short. After 6 weeks of intensive investigation, Manley was eliminated as a suspect, though the experience had destroyed his marriage and left him emotionally devastated. The Manley investigation consumed enormous investigative resources and demonstrated the challenges faced by detectives attempting to separate legitimate leads from false confessions and attention-seeking behavior. Every tip and confession required thorough investigation, creating a workload that quickly overwhelmed the assigned detective team and forced Captain Donahoe to assign additional personnel to the case. By the end of February, more than 20 detectives were working on various aspects of the Black Dahlia investigation. The media attention also attracted individuals with claimed psychic abilities who offered to assist in identifying Elizabeth's killer through supernatural means. While Detective Hansen dismissed these offers, the publicity surrounding the case led to the formation of amateur detective groups who conducted their own investigations and regularly submitted their findings to the police department. These amateur efforts, while well-intentioned, often duplicated official investigative work and occasionally interfered with legitimate police activities. The sensationalized newspaper coverage of the case established Elizabeth Short posthumously as a symbol of Hollywood's corruption and the dangers faced by young women seeking fame and fortune in Los Angeles. Editorial writers used the case to criticize the entertainment industry's exploitation of vulnerable young women, while advice columnists warned their readers about the risks of trusting strangers and pursuing unrealistic dreams. This moralizing coverage often overshadowed the actual investigative work and contributed to the development of myths about Elizabeth's character and lifestyle that persist to this day. Chapter 7. The suspect list grows. As the investigation entered its second month, Detective Hansen had compiled a list of more than 100 potential suspects, ranging from men who had known Elizabeth personally to individuals with previous convictions for sexual violence who lived in the Los Angeles area. Each suspect required thorough background investigation, alibi verification, and psychological evaluation, creating an enormous workload that stretched the LAPD's detective division to its limits. Among the most promising early suspects was Dr. George Hill Hodel, a prominent Los Angeles physician whose Hollywood home had been the site of parties attended by actors, writers, and other entertainment industry figures. Dr. Hodel had been investigated previously in connection with sexual assault allegations, and his medical background provided him with the anatomical knowledge that investigators believed was necessary to perform the precise bisection of Elizabeth's body. The investigation of Dr. Hodel revealed a complex and troubled individual whose behavior had attracted police attention on several previous occasions. He had been accused of inappropriate sexual conduct with multiple women, including allegations of sexual assault that had been settled out of court. His home on Franklin Avenue in Hollywood had been the subject of neighborhood complaints about loud parties, unusual activities, and suspicious visitors at all hours of the day and night. Detective Brown conducted surveillance of Dr. Hodel's residence and observed behavior that appeared consistent with someone attempting to conceal evidence or avoid police attention. Hodel frequently left his home during nighttime hours, made unexplained trips to remote locations outside the city, and appeared to be monitoring police activities related to the Black Dahlia investigation. However, efforts to obtain search warrants for Hodel's home and medical office were unsuccessful due to insufficient probable cause and his prominent position in Los Angeles society. Another significant suspect was Leslie Dillon, a 27-year-old bellhop and aspiring writer who had contacted police claiming to have information about Elizabeth's murder. Dillon's initial letter to investigators contained details about the crime that had not been released to the public, leading Detective Hansen to arrange a meeting to evaluate Dillon's potential involvement in the case. During this interview, Dillon demonstrated extensive knowledge of the crime scene and the mutilation inflicted upon Elizabeth's body. Under interrogation, Dillon claimed that his information about the murder had come from a friend named Jeff Connors, who had allegedly confessed to killing Elizabeth during a drunken conversation. However, investigators were unable to locate anyone named Jeff Connors matching Dillon's description, leading them to suspect that Dillon had invented this fictional accomplice to deflect suspicion from himself while revealing his insider knowledge of the crime. Psychological evaluation of Leslie Dillon revealed a deeply disturbed individual with a history of obsessive behavior toward women and a fascination with violence and mutilation. His writing samples, which he had submitted to various magazines and publishers, contained graphic descriptions of sexual violence that bore disturbing similarities to the treatment inflicted upon Elizabeth Short. However, Dillon's alibi for the crucial period of Elizabeth's disappearance appeared to be supported by witnesses, creating doubt about his direct involvement in the murder. The investigation also focused on numerous men who had dated Elizabeth during her final months in Los Angeles, including several married individuals who had promised to leave their wives for her. These men had obvious motives for wanting to silence Elizabeth if she had threatened to expose their extramarital relationships, particularly those whose careers or social standing could have been damaged by such revelations. Detective Hansen systematically investigated each of these relationships, looking for evidence of threats, violence, or unusual behavior during the period leading up to Elizabeth's death. Among the men who had been romantically involved with Elizabeth was Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner and theatrical agent who had allowed Elizabeth to stay at his home on several occasions. Hansen had provided Elizabeth with temporary lodging and had introduced her to various men in the entertainment industry who he claimed might be able to help her career. However, witnesses reported that Hansen's relationship with Elizabeth had become increasingly troubled as she failed to show appropriate gratitude for his assistance and continued to pursue relationships with other men. The investigation of Mark Hansen revealed a pattern of relationships with young aspiring actresses whom he had promised to help achieve stardom. Several of these women reported that Hansen had demanded sexual favors in exchange for his assistance and had become angry and vindictive when they refused his advances or began relationships with other men. However, Hansen's alibi for the crucial period appeared to be solid, and investigators found no physical evidence linking him to Elizabeth's murder. Detective Brown also investigated several individuals with previous convictions for sexual violence who lived in the Los Angeles area and whose psychological profile suggested they might be capable of the extreme brutality displayed in Elizabeth's murder. These suspects included men who had been released from prison or mental institutions during the months preceding the crime, as well as individuals who had been reported to police for suspicious behavior toward women. One particularly disturbing suspect was Jack Anderson Wilson, a convicted child molester who had been released from prison just 3 months before Elizabeth's murder. Wilson had a history of violence toward women and children, and psychiatric evaluations had diagnosed him with severe personality disorders that included sadistic tendencies. However, Wilson's physical appearance did not match witness descriptions of men seen with Elizabeth during her final weeks, and his known associates provided alibis that appeared to eliminate him as a suspect. The investigation also examined the possibility that Elizabeth's murder had been committed by someone within the entertainment industry who had access to the kinds of private locations where the extensive post-mortem procedures could have been performed without detection. This theory led investigators to examine movie studios, theatrical facilities, and other entertainment-related businesses that might have provided the killer with both opportunity and the tools necessary to commit such a methodical crime. Several individuals connected to the film industry became subjects of intensive investigation, including a studio executive who had been known to host private parties where young actresses were allegedly exploited and abused. This executive had access to studio facilities during nighttime hours and possessed the kind of connections that could have enabled him to dispose of evidence and avoid police detection. However, the investigation of this suspect was complicated by the entertainment industry's tendency to protect its own members and the reluctance of potential witnesses to cooperate with police. Chapter 8. The Killer's Communications. 3 weeks after the discovery of Elizabeth Short's body, the investigation took a dramatic turn when the Los Angeles Examiner received a package containing items that appeared to have belonged to the victim. The package had been mailed from downtown Los Angeles and contained Elizabeth's birth certificate, social security card, photographs, and an address book with several pages torn out. Accompanying these items was a note constructed from letters cut from newspapers that read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings letter to follow." The arrival of this package confirmed investigators' suspicions that they were dealing with a killer who craved public attention and was closely following media coverage of the case. The decision to send Elizabeth's personal effects to the newspaper rather than to the police suggested someone who understood the value of media manipulation and wanted to ensure maximum publicity for his communications. Detective Hansen immediately recognized that this development could provide crucial evidence if properly handled. The FBI's crime laboratory in Washington analyzed the package and its contents, looking for fingerprints, handwriting samples, or other forensic evidence that might identify the sender. However, the killer had been extremely careful in preparing the package, wearing gloves and using only materials that could not be traced to a specific source. The newspaper letters used to construct the message had been cut from various publications, making it impossible to determine which specific newspapers or magazines had been used. The photographs included in the package showed Elizabeth with several unidentified men, providing investigators with new potential suspects and witnesses. These photographs appeared to have been taken during Elizabeth's final months in Los Angeles and showed her in various social settings, including nightclubs, restaurants, and private parties. Detective Brown began the painstaking process of identifying the men in these photographs and determining when and where the pictures had been taken. The address book proved to be one of the most valuable pieces of evidence recovered during the entire investigation. Although several pages had been torn out, the remaining entries provided investigators with a comprehensive list of Elizabeth's contacts and associates during her time in Los Angeles. Each name and phone number represented a potential lead, and detectives began systematically interviewing every person listed in the book. 2 days after the first package arrived, the examiner received a second communication from the killer, a postcard with a message that read, "Have changed my mind. You would not give me a square deal. Dahlia killing was justified." This message suggested that the killer had been monitoring police activities and media coverage and had become dissatisfied with some aspect of the investigation or its public presentation. The second communication was subjected to the same intensive forensic analysis as the first package, but again yielded no usable physical evidence. The killer's careful preparation and attention to avoiding detection demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that impressed even experienced investigators. The use of common materials and the absence of any personal touches suggested someone with either previous criminal experience or extensive knowledge of police investigative techniques. Detective Hansen recognized that the killer's desire for communication and publicity could potentially be used to draw him into making mistakes that might lead to his identification. Working with postal authorities, the LAPD established monitoring procedures for mail delivered to local newspapers, hoping to intercept additional communications before they could be published. However, no further letters or packages were received, suggesting that the killer had satisfied his need for attention or had recognized the risks involved in continued communication. The psychological profile developed by police consultants suggested that the killer was an intelligent individual with a need for recognition and control. The decision to send evidence to the newspaper rather than to police indicated someone who understood media dynamics and wanted to ensure public awareness of his crimes. The careful preparation of the communications demonstrated patience and planning ability, while the content suggested someone who felt justified in his actions and wanted public acknowledgement of his perceived grievances. The analysis of the torn pages from Elizabeth's address book revealed a deliberate pattern in what had been removed. The missing pages appeared to contain entries for men whose names began with specific letters of the alphabet, suggesting that the killer had systematically removed information about individuals who might have been able to identify him. This selective removal of evidence indicated that the killer had personal knowledge of Elizabeth's social circle and relationships. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit provided investigators with additional insights into the killer's psychological makeup based on the communications and the crime scene evidence. The profile suggested a white male between the ages of 25 and 40, with above-average intelligence and possible medical or anatomical knowledge. The killer likely lived alone or had access to a private location where he could work without interruption, and probably had a history of troubled relationships with women. The communications from the killer generated additional media attention and public interest in the case, but also created new challenges for investigators. The publication of details about the killer's letters and packages led to a flood of copycat communications from individuals seeking attention or attempting to insert themselves into the investigation. Each of these false communications required investigation and analysis, consuming valuable resources and complicating the search for authentic evidence. Chapter 9. The investigation continues. As the Black Dahlia investigation entered its sixth month, Detective Hansen faced the sobering reality that despite the expenditure of thousands of investigative hours and the examination of hundreds of potential suspects, the case remained essentially unsolved. The LAPD had assembled one of the most comprehensive case files in the department's history, containing witness statements, suspect interviews, laboratory reports, and psychological analyses, but no definitive evidence pointing to Elizabeth Short's killer had emerged. The pressure to solve the case continued to mount from multiple sources: the media, the public, and the police department's own leadership. Captain Donahoe had committed unprecedented resources to the investigation, assigning more than 30 detectives to various aspects of the case at its peak. However, the lack of progress had begun to create tension within the department and criticism from city officials who questioned whether the investigation was being conducted efficiently. Detective Brown continued to pursue leads related to the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene and from the killer's communications. The rope marks on Elizabeth's body had been analyzed by experts who determined that the binding material was common cotton clothesline available at any hardware store in Los Angeles. Similarly, the tool marks left by the bisection of the body confirmed the use of an extremely sharp knife or surgical instrument, but could not narrow the field of potential weapons beyond this general category. The investigation of Dr. George Hodel intensified during this period, as detectives discovered additional evidence of his involvement with young women who fit Elizabeth's general description and background. Witnesses reported seeing Hodel with unidentified young women at his Franklin Avenue residence, and several individuals came forward to report suspicious activities at the house during the period when Elizabeth was believed to have been held captive by her killer. However, efforts to obtain search warrants for Dr. Hodel's residence and medical office continued to be frustrated by legal challenges and his prominent position in Los Angeles society. Hodel's attorney successfully argued that the evidence against his client was circumstantial and insufficient to justify the intrusive searches requested by police. This legal protection allowed Hodel to avoid the kind of intensive investigation that had been applied to other suspects in the case. The surveillance of Leslie Dillon revealed increasingly erratic behavior that suggested either guilt or severe psychological disturbance. Dillon appeared to be monitoring police activities related to the case and made several attempts to contact investigators with additional information about Elizabeth's murder. However, each new piece of information he provided either proved to be already known to police or was impossible to verify, leading investigators to question whether Dillon was attempting to mislead the investigation or was simply a disturbed individual seeking attention. Detective Hansen also continued to investigate the numerous men who had been romantically involved with Elizabeth during her final months in Los Angeles. This aspect of the investigation revealed the extent to which Elizabeth's desperate search for love and security had exposed her to potentially dangerous individuals. Many of the men she had dated were married, emotionally unstable, or involved in criminal activities that made them viable suspects in her murder. The investigation of Mark Hansen, the nightclub owner who had provided Elizabeth with temporary lodging, uncovered additional disturbing information about his relationships with young aspiring actresses. Several women came forward to report that Hansen had become increasingly controlling and possessive when they attempted to end their relationships with him, and at least one woman reported that he had threatened her with violence when she refused his advances. However, Hansen's alibi for the crucial period continued to appear solid, supported by multiple witnesses who placed him at his nightclub during the evenings when Elizabeth was believed to have been abducted and killed. The investigation of Hansen demonstrated the challenges faced by detectives in a case where numerous individuals had both opportunity and potential motive, but where solid alibi evidence eliminated them as viable suspects. The psychological analysis of the crime continued to suggest that Elizabeth's killer was someone with significant mental disturbance, possibly including previous experience with violence against women. The extreme nature of the mutilation, combined with the careful preparation and display of the body, indicated a perpetrator who derived satisfaction from both the act of killing and the public attention generated by his crimes. FBI behavioral analysts working with the LAPD suggested that the killer might attempt to commit similar crimes if he had not been apprehended, but no cases with comparable characteristics were reported in Los Angeles or surrounding areas during the months following Elizabeth's murder. This absence of similar crimes suggested either that the killer had satisfied his psychological needs through Elizabeth's murder, had left the Los Angeles area, or had been deterred by the intensive police investigation. The lack of progress in the case began to affect the morale of the investigating detectives, who had invested enormous personal and professional effort in attempting to identify Elizabeth's killer. Detective Hansen, in particular, became increasingly frustrated with the limitations imposed by legal procedures and the challenges of investigating suspects with sufficient resources to hire competent legal representation. Chapter 10. Decades of Mystery. By the end of 1947, the Black Dahlia investigation had consumed more than 10,000 investigative hours and had cost the LAPD an estimated $50,000 in overtime pay, laboratory analysis, and administrative expenses. Despite this unprecedented commitment of resources, the case remained officially unsolved, though investigators continued to follow up on occasional tips and new information that emerged periodically. The failure to solve Elizabeth Short's murder had lasting effects on the Los Angeles Police Department and on the careers of the detectives who had devoted months of their professional lives to the investigation. Detective Hansen, despite his reputation as one of the department's most capable investigators, never fully recovered from the frustration of being unable to bring Elizabeth's killer to justice. The case became a defining moment in his career and a source of personal torment that affected him for the remainder of his service with the LAPD. The media attention surrounding the case gradually diminished as other crimes and news events captured public interest, but the Black Dahlia murder remained a subject of ongoing fascination for crime writers, amateur detectives, and conspiracy theorists. Books, articles, and eventually films were produced that offered various theories about Elizabeth's killer, though none of these productions provided evidence sufficient to reopen the official investigation. Over the following decades, numerous individuals came forward claiming to have solved the Black Dahlia case or to possess new evidence about Elizabeth's killer. These claims ranged from deathbed confessions by elderly men who claimed to have known the killer to elaborate conspiracy theories involving organized crime, corrupt police officials, or entertainment industry figures. However, none of these claims withstood serious scrutiny or provided evidence that could be verified through official investigation. The case files from the original investigation were eventually transferred to the LAPD's Cold Case Unit, where they remained available for review by detectives working on similar unsolved crimes. Periodically, advances in forensic technology led to re-examination of physical evidence from the case, including attempts to recover DNA evidence from Elizabeth's clothing and personal effects. However, the age of the evidence and the methods used in its original collection made such analysis extremely difficult. In the 1970s, a former LAPD detective named Steve Hodel began investigating the possibility that his father, Dr. George Hill Hodel, had been responsible for Elizabeth Short's murder. The younger Hodel's investigation revealed additional circumstantial evidence connecting his father to the crime, including photographs found among the doctor's possessions that appeared to show Elizabeth Short and crime scene locations. However, this evidence was insufficient to reopen the official investigation or to definitively establish Dr. Hodel's guilt. The mystery surrounding Elizabeth Short's murder became intertwined with the mythology of Los Angeles and Hollywood, representing the dark side of the American dream and the dangers faced by young people seeking fame and fortune in the entertainment capital. Elizabeth's story became a cautionary tale about the exploitation of vulnerable individuals and the violence that could lurk beneath the glamorous surface of celebrity culture. Modern criminal profilers and forensic experts who have reviewed the Black Dahlia case files generally agree that the killer possessed significant psychological disturbance and probably had previous experience with violence against women. The methodical nature of the crime and the killer's apparent ability to avoid detection suggests someone with either medical knowledge or previous criminal experience. However, the passage of time and the deaths of potential witnesses have made it extremely unlikely that the case will ever be officially solved. The impact of Elizabeth Short's murder extended far beyond the immediate investigation, influencing police procedures for handling high-profile cases and media relations during criminal investigations. The intense publicity surrounding the case demonstrated both the potential benefits and dangers of media involvement in criminal investigations, lessons that continue to influence law enforcement practices today. The Black Dahlia case also highlighted the challenges faced by police departments in investigating crimes that generate enormous public interest and media attention. The pressure to solve such cases quickly can lead to rushed investigations and false arrests, while the publicity can attract false confessions and misleading information that complicate the search for truth. These lessons learned from the Black Dahlia investigation have been applied to numerous subsequent high-profile criminal cases. Despite the passage of more than 7 decades since Elizabeth Short's murder, the case continues to generate public interest and speculation. New books and documentaries are produced regularly, each offering different theories about the killer's identity and motives. However, the official investigation remains closed, with no viable suspects and no prospect of resolution through conventional investigative methods. The enduring mystery of the Black Dahlia murder serves as a reminder of the limitations of criminal investigation, even when enormous resources are committed to solving a case. Sometimes, despite the best efforts of dedicated professionals and the application of the most advanced investigative techniques available, the truth remains elusive. Elizabeth Short's killer succeeded in committing what may be the perfect crime, leaving behind only questions and speculation about one of the most notorious murders in American criminal history. Today's case of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, reminds us that justice, while sometimes delayed, cannot always be served. Despite the persistent efforts of dedicated investigators, the cooperation of witnesses willing to speak truth, and a legal system committed to accountability. Some crimes, no matter how thoroughly investigated or how many resources are devoted to their solution, remain forever shrouded in mystery. For the family of Elizabeth Short, the failure to identify her killer meant that closure could never be achieved through the traditional means of arrest, trial, and conviction. However, the extraordinary efforts made by Detective Hansen, Detective Brown, and dozens of other investigators demonstrated the commitment of law enforcement to pursue justice even in the most challenging circumstances. Their work ensured that Elizabeth's death was not forgotten, and that every possible lead was thoroughly investigated. The Black Dahlia case serves as a sobering reminder that some criminals possess the intelligence, planning ability, and psychological detachment necessary to commit heinous crimes while avoiding detection and punishment. Despite advances in forensic science and investigative techniques, the fundamental challenge of solving complex crimes still depends on evidence, witnesses, and sometimes an element of chance that was absent in Elizabeth Short's case. If today's case has affected you, remember that support is available through victim services organizations nationwide. For those who work in law enforcement, forensics, or victim advocacy, cases like the Black Dahlia demonstrate both the importance of your work and the reality that not every case can be solved, despite your best efforts and dedication. Thank you for joining us on True Crime Open and Closed. Until next time, remember that every case investigated brings us closer to understanding the criminal mind. Every victim deserves to be remembered with dignity, and every truth revealed, even decades later, honors the memory of those we've lost to violence.